I gave everything to support my wife's dream cafe, only to discover she was living out her own twisted romance novel with a mystery man. Now, after serving her divorce papers in front of her loyal customers, she's begging for forgiveness. I'm a 30-year-old guy who's been married to my wife, who's 27, for the past 4 years. When people hear how quickly we got married, they're often surprised. She was just 23 at the time. My parents were skeptical too, telling us to wait a few more years. But the connection we had felt undeniable, like we understood each other perfectly. We only dated for about 15 months before tying the knot, which seems crazy in hindsight. Back then, though, we felt like soulmates. These days, with everything that's happened, I can't help wondering if we jumped into something we weren't prepared for. My brothers and I run a jewelry business that's been a huge part of my life. We started out working in our parents' garage, handcrafting pieces and selling them at local markets. Now, we've got 3 stores in the city and an online shop that ships across the country. Most people think that working with family is a recipe for disaster. I've definitely heard the horror stories. But my brothers and I have always been close, even as kids. We each take care of different parts of the business, and somehow we've managed to grow without any major arguments or issues. If anything, it's brought us closer together. My wife has always dreamed of opening a cafe that combines her love of coffee and books. She's a total bookworm. Before we met, I used to roll my eyes at people who made reading their whole personality, constantly posting quotes on social media and carrying books everywhere. Now I'm married to one of those people. Funny how life works. When she pitched the cafe idea, I wanted to help her make it happen. Rent in the upscale area she wanted was expensive, but I covered it because I knew it would give the cafe the best shot at success. The place has taken off. There's always a crowd of people reading, working, or meeting up for coffee. She's even started hosting book clubs and author events. Seeing her happy and the business thriving made all the financial support worth it, or so I thought. Things started changing in March. Before that, our marriage was pretty standard. We'd have date nights every Friday, watch movies on weekends, and she'd often tell me about her interesting customers. Usually it was stories about a writer working on their novel or a student who basically lived there during finals. But this time was different. One evening, she told me about a new customer. The way she talked about him was strange. She kept describing how handsome he was, how well he dressed, and how he had this mysterious aura about him. We've always been open about noticing attractive people. I'd mention her pretty friend, or she'd point out an attractive woman at the gym. And it was never a big deal because we trusted each other. But something in the way she spoke about this guy raised red flags for me. She sounded almost like a teenager with a crush, talking about his jawline and his accent. The whole thing reminded me of the romance novels she's always reading, the ones with shirtless guys on the covers that she insists are really well written. Once she made me read one about a Russian assassin who falls in love with his target in a laundromat. The way she described this new guy was the exact way she talked about that fictional character, all mysterious, brooding, and flawless. It felt off, but I tried to brush it aside. The next day, she was eager to tell me more about him. His name was Dmitry from Serbia, and she seemed to know his entire life story. Apparently, he'd run a successful car dealership back home, but moved to the US for better opportunities. Classic American dream stuff. He was job hunting at local dealerships to get settled here. From the way she talked about their conversation, it sounded like they'd talked for hours. My wife is always friendly with customers, but this felt different. She kept mentioning how he was struggling to adapt to life here, and I could tell she felt this urge to help him. Over time, I learned more details about Dmitry. He was tall and blonde, dressed like a model, despite supposedly being between jobs. She described his accent and how he was into specific genres of books. What got to me was how she described every detail about him, almost like she was creating a character in one of her romance novels. The way she talked about his mysterious European charm and cultured personality was unsettling. My wife has always been enthusiastic about meeting people who share her interests, but this felt like she was building a fantasy in her mind. After a few weeks, the constant updates about Dmitry started to fade. She wasn't coming home every day with new stories about him, which was honestly a relief. Still, I knew he was a regular at the cafe, as she'd mention him casually now and then. One day, I decided to surprise her with lunch. Not just to be thoughtful, but also because I was curious about this guy. Sure enough, there he was, sitting in the corner, reading a book. I hate to admit it, but he matched her description perfectly, tall, good-looking, and well-dressed. Things really took a turn one night when she came home late. She had this dreamy, almost dazed smile on her face, the kind teenagers have after their first kiss. When I asked what was going on, she said Dmitri had walked her home. They'd spent hours talking about books and life, and then he had supposedly asked her out. She told me she reminded him she was married, and he apologetically held her hand before saying goodnight. What got to me most was her reaction. She was practically glowing, as if being asked out by another man while married was some sort of accomplishment. When I asked why she was so thrilled, she actually said it felt like something out of a book. I couldn't stop thinking about how often they'd see each other at the cafe. She was there 6 days a week, and he was a regular. Plus, we only lived a few blocks away. What really bothered me was that she seemed to enjoy his attention. She hadn't shut him down completely or said these walks needed to end. Instead, she seemed to treat it like an exciting subplot in her life. I wanted to tell her to suggest he find another cafe to frequent, but I didn't want to come across as the jealous, controlling husband. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. After all, she did tell him she was married. She could have hidden it if she wanted to. But this nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Maybe it was because my last girlfriend before my wife had a harmless friendship with a coworker that turned into a full-blown affair. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that this was all in my head. My wife loved me and we had a good marriage. She was just being friendly with a customer who shared her interests. But each night when she came home, I found myself wondering if he'd walked her back again. The worst part was that I couldn't even talk to my brothers about it. They'd either say I was overthinking, or they'd want to confront Dmitri. So I kept quiet and waited, trying to see if things would sort themselves out. About a week after the night he walked her home, my wife came in with a massive bouquet of flowers. Not the cheap grocery store kind either. These were high-end roses from that expensive florist downtown. She was humming to herself while arranging them in the vase we'd used at our wedding. Then she casually mentioned they were from Dmitri. Apparently, he'd gotten a new job at a car dealership and bought flowers for a coworker's birthday. According to her, he had some extras and thought she deserved them because she worked so hard. It all sounded like complete nonsense. Who spends that much on fancy flowers just to hand out extras to the local cafe owner? I couldn't believe she was acting oblivious about the situation, as if she genuinely didn't know why he'd given her flowers. This was the same guy who'd already asked her out and held her hand after all. When I directly asked her if she thought Dmitri had feelings for her, her response made me want to scream. "Oh yeah, it's obvious he likes me, especially after he asked me out, but these flowers are just friendly." Meanwhile, I remembered how she got upset with me a month earlier for liking an Instagram photo of a girl from years ago. Let me tell you something about guys. We don't buy flowers for women who've rejected us, especially not for married women, as a friendly gesture. That's not how it works. Dmitri wasn't just being friendly. He was playing the long game. He probably realized he couldn't win her over with a direct approach, so he was wearing her down with these innocent gestures and attention. And, judging by how my wife was acting, his plan was working. The whole situation reminded me of how my cousin's marriage unraveled. His wife had a friendly personal trainer who kept giving her protein shakes and workout gear as so-called professional courtesies. 6 months later, she was living with him. I could see the same pattern happening here, but my wife was too caught up in her romantic daydream to see it. Or maybe she didn't want to. My suspicions were confirmed just 2 days after the flower incident. My wife was supposed to be home by 6:30 as usual, but 7:30 came and went without a sign of her. By 8 o'clock, I'd called her twice with no response. She'd been late before, sometimes the cafe got busy, or she'd have inventory to handle, but this time felt different. I kept checking our security camera, hoping to see her coming up the driveway. I even tried checking her location on Find My iPhone, but it was turned off. My mind started going to dark places. She finally walked in around 8:45, practically buzzing with excitement. Instead of apologizing for being late or explaining why she hadn't answered her phone, she launched right into this story about her incredible evening. Turns out, she'd taken Dmitri on a full tour of downtown. They'd gone to the art museum, something he'd apparently always wanted to see, and then grabbed pizza at Tony's because he'd never had real American pizza before. The way she described every detail of their little adventure, it was like listening to someone recounting a first date. My wife, who normally just wants to order takeout and watch Netflix after work, suddenly had the energy for a 3-hour outing with this guy. What really got to me was how she didn't seem to think any of this was wrong. She was telling me her husband about her romantic evening with another man, as though she were confiding in a friend about a new crush. I thought about all the times she'd told me she was too tired to go out to dinner after work or complained that the museum was always too crowded. But apparently, she had no problem mustering up energy for museum visits and pizza dates with Dmitri. After she finished her story, I couldn't hold back anymore. I looked her straight in the eyes and asked if she was attracted to Dmitri. The way her expression changed when I asked, that told me everything, even before she started stumbling over her answer. Her reaction was almost comically exaggerated. She got all defensive, even putting a hand on her chest, as if I'd accused her of some terrible crime. She insisted she was only being a kind person, helping this poor guy adjust to American life. She went on about how Dmitri didn't know anyone here, how he was struggling to understand American culture, and that she was just trying to be welcoming. She even brought up how her grandparents were immigrants and that someone had helped them adjust when they first arrived. The entire time she's explaining, she's pacing around the kitchen, moving things around unnecessarily, avoiding eye contact, basically all her usual tells when she's lying. That's when I told her she needed to stop seeing Dmitri outside of the cafe. You'd have thought I'd told her to stop breathing. She completely lost it, flipping it all back onto me. Suddenly, I was insecure, controlling, toxic, and jealous. She pointed out that I'd never had an issue with her other male friends before, conveniently ignoring that those men were either gay or married. Then she started crying, saying I didn't trust her, and that she couldn't believe I'd think she'd ever cheat. Meanwhile, I was thinking about how she'd hidden Dimitri's texts when I first saw one pop up on her phone, or how she'd started keeping her phone face down around me. I somehow managed to keep my cool, which wasn't easy, considering I wanted to punch a wall. I tried to help her see my side. I asked how she'd feel if some beautiful Serbian woman started coming to my jewelry store every day, and I started taking her on personal tours of the city. What if I bought this woman gifts and let her hold my hand? What if I came home late because I was out showing her around? My wife just rolled her eyes and said it was different, though she wouldn't explain how. Then she brought up this old college friend who'd had a crush on her, like somehow that was the same situation. By that point, I'd already seen enough red flags to start a parade, and watching her try to justify everything only confirmed what I was already suspecting. Something was definitely happening between them. She actually tried to tell me I'd understand if the roles were reversed, right? Because she'd totally be calm if I started spending alone time with an attractive woman who was clearly interested in me. This is the same woman who once made me unfollow my ex from a decade ago on Instagram and got upset when my female cousin hugged me a little too long at Christmas. But I'm supposed to be completely fine with her acting as this guy's personal tour guide. I know we'd said at the start of our marriage that we wouldn't get upset if we found someone else attractive, but that only works if we're open about it and don't take it any further, which she clearly had. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night, which wasn't all that surprising. What was surprising was how quiet things became after that fight. She stopped mentioning Dmitri completely. No more stories about what he was reading or doing, nothing. She was coming home on time every night, and everything seemed like it was going back to normal. I started thinking that maybe I had overreacted, that maybe she'd actually listened and set some boundaries. My brother even noticed that I seemed less stressed at work. I was finally beginning to feel like I could breathe again. Then came that random Tuesday afternoon when I decided to surprise her at the cafe. I'd just wrapped up a big sale at the jewelry store and thought maybe we could grab a late lunch together. But when I walked in, her employees were running the place, but she was nowhere in sight. My wife practically lives at that cafe. She's there from open to close, managing everything herself. She never takes lunch breaks or runs errands during business hours, always saying that a good boss needs to be present. I asked one of her employees where she was, but they gave me some vague answer about her stepping out for a bit. Something in my gut told me to stay quiet and just wait instead of making a scene. So I went back to my car across the street and sat there, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. That's when I saw them. My wife and Dmitri walking up the street together, arms linked like they were on a date. She was laughing at something he'd said, leaning into him the way she used to with me. They looked like a couple, not like a cafe owner and her customer, not like friends, but like an actual couple. I sat there gripping my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, watching her act like a completely different person with the guy she'd promised to stop seeing. At that moment, I knew our marriage was probably over, but I also knew I needed proof before making any decisions. Seeing them together, it took every ounce of control not to lose it right then and there. My first instinct was to jump out of the car and confront them both. Maybe even show Dmitri what happens when you mess with another man's wife. I've never been a violent person. The most aggressive thing I've done is yell at a ref at my nephew's basketball game. But watching them together like that, so comfortable and intimate, I had to plant my feet to keep myself from acting. I kept thinking about my business and how assault charges could jeopardize everything my brothers and I had worked for. So I just sat there, watching them disappear into the cafe like nothing was wrong, as if my entire world wasn't crumbling. Yesterday felt like the longest day of my life. I must have typed out 50 angry texts to her, only to delete them all. I wanted to call my brothers, but I knew they'd either tell me I was overreacting or head straight to Dimitri's workplace looking for a fight. I even thought about calling her parents, who had always treated me like family. Her dad had even helped us set up the cafe. But I decided to stay quiet for now and see how things unfolded. Information is power, right? And right now, I had information she didn't know I had. When she got home that evening, I played it cool. I asked her about her day as if nothing was wrong. She sat there at our kitchen counter, eating the dinner I'd made, telling me about some new coffee blend they were trying at the cafe and how busy it had been. Not a single mention of spending the afternoon with Dmitri. This is the same woman who used to share every little detail of her day with me, down to what her regulars ordered for breakfast. Now, she was lying straight to my face while eating the lasagna I'd spent 2 hours preparing. That's when I realized I needed to be smart about this. If I confronted her now, she'd just deny everything, delete any evidence, and get better at hiding whatever was going on. Update 1. Hey everyone, here's an update about my situation with my wife and her Serbian friend. After seeing them together that day, I realized I needed actual proof of what was happening. I've always been against going through someone's phone. My ex used to check mine constantly, and I hated it. But after weeks of lies and shady behavior, I felt like I had no other option. Either I snooped through her phone or kept driving myself crazy imagining what might be going on. I waited until she was asleep. She always takes strong sleeping pills for her insomnia, which knock her out completely. She'd been acting strange all day, constantly checking her phone and smiling at it, which only made me more suspicious. Around midnight, while she was out cold, I grabbed her phone from the nightstand. I found their WhatsApp chat immediately. She hadn't even tried to hide it. They were texting each other constantly, all day, every day. Running our online jewelry store has made me pretty tech-savvy, so I knew how to export their entire chat history and send it to myself. Then I went through her photos, and there were dozens of pictures of them together at restaurants, parks, museums, places she'd told me she was too busy to visit with me. In one photo, they were at this upscale Italian restaurant I'd tried to take her to for our anniversary, but she said it was too expensive. The whole time I was doing this, I kept glancing over at her sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about her little Serbian romance. There I was, going through her phone like some desperate person, while she had no idea her perfect affair was about to blow up. I made sure to cover my tracks, deleted the message exports, cleared the recently sent photos, even erased the WhatsApp web history. It only took a few minutes, but it felt like hours. After transferring the files to my phone, I went downstairs to read through everything. I wish I hadn't. The messages started innocently enough, talking about books, coffee, and his adjustment to life in the US. But then I found a conversation that made me physically sick. They'd been discussing a romance novel my wife recommended to him, probably one of those books she was always trying to get me to read. But their chat quickly took a turn. They were comparing themselves to the characters in the book, some story about a forbidden romance. Then Dmitri started making comments about the intimate scenes, and about her. My wife, who I'd been with for 5 years, who I'd helped build a business for, who I thought I knew inside and out, was bragging about sleeping with him. They weren't even trying to hide it. The messages were explicit, talking about their hookups and joking about how the affair made things more thrilling. She even wrote that she didn't regret cheating on me. She was proud of it, getting off on the whole forbidden romance angle, like it was one of her ridiculous books. The woman I married, who cried during our wedding vows and swore she'd be faithful, was treating our marriage like some cheap storyline in her real-life romance novel. I couldn't stay in the house after reading that. It was 2 a.m. and freezing outside, but I just had to get out. I started walking with no destination in mind, repeatedly checking my phone and rereading the messages, torturing myself with every detail. When I finally came back around 3 a.m., my feet were blistered and I was half frozen. She was still asleep in our bed. I checked her phone one last time and took a video of their chat, just in case she tried to delete everything later. I recorded everything, not just screenshots. I took actual video footage, scrolling through their conversations, showing the timestamps, contact info, everything. I've seen enough messy divorce cases where evidence is manipulated. I wasn't going to let them wriggle out of this one. I recorded their whole chat history, the photos, everything. Let's see her try to explain this away as being friendly with a customer. The worst part wasn't even the cheating. It was the fact they were laughing about it. They'd turned my life into their private joke. All those nights I worked late at the jewelry store to help cover her cafe's rent. And meanwhile, she was sneaking around with him, mocking me behind my back. Reading those messages, seeing how she joked about having a husband at home while being with him, made me realize she wasn't just cheating. She was enjoying the humiliation. She'd even told him personal things I'd shared with her, private details meant to be between us. She might think she's living in some romance novel, where the bored wife finds excitement with a mysterious foreign man. But this isn't a story where everyone gets a happy ending. I've already started looking up divorce lawyers and found one who specializes in infidelity cases. I'm done playing the part of the oblivious husband in her twisted little fantasy. Update 2. Finally, I can tell you all how everything played out. After weeks of meticulous planning with my lawyer, we put everything in motion. I hired a process server and paid extra to ensure it would happen during the cafe's busiest lunch hour. I took an Uber and waited across the street, ready to watch the whole thing unfold. The server walked into the packed cafe, past all her regulars and book club members, and served her the divorce papers right at the counter. She tried to pull him aside to handle it privately in the back, but he loudly announced he was serving her with divorce papers. I watched through the window as her perfect little world crumbled. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the envelope. Some of her beloved book club ladies were there too, witnessing everything. So much for her polished cafe owner image. I spent the rest of the day at the jewelry store, honestly in a great mood. My brothers noticed too, since usually I check my phone constantly, but that day I didn't even care. No missed calls, no texts begging for forgiveness, nothing. She knew she'd been caught. The prenup, ironically her idea because her parents insisted on it, had a clear infidelity clause. She wasn't getting anything from me. When she finally came home that night, she looked terrible. Her makeup was smeared, eyes swollen from crying, nose running. Nothing like the confident woman who'd been sneaking around with her Serbian boyfriend. She kept asking me over and over what she'd done wrong, like she genuinely didn't know. The best part was watching her try to guess exactly how much I knew. She kept suggesting different possibilities, trying to gauge my reaction. Was it because of Dimitri? Did someone say something? Was it about her being late some nights? She was scrambling, desperately trying to see if she could still lie her way out of it. I just sat there, watching her flounder, knowing I had all the evidence backed up in 3 different places. Finally, I decided to give her a hint. I told her I'd seen her and Dimitri walking arm in arm that day she was supposed to be working. You should have seen her face. It changed instantly. She went from a sobbing mess to completely defensive. She claimed I was overreacting, that I was throwing away our marriage over one innocent walk. She called me insecure and controlling, then in the same breath begged me to reconsider. She even suggested couples counseling, like that could somehow fix what she'd done. She kept switching between insulting me and pleading with me. I'd had enough of her performance, so I told her to leave my house. Not our house, my house. The one I'd bought before we got married, which she seemed to forget. She tried to argue, but I just pointed at the door. Once she was gone, I called my lawyer. I'd already moved most of our joint accounts into separate ones, documenting everything with the bank. Being in business has taught me how to handle finances properly, and it was definitely paying off now. She might have thought she was living in some romance novel, but divorce was about to get real. I hired the best divorce lawyer in the city, the same one who handled my friend's divorce when his wife cheated with her neighbor. This guy wasn't cheap, but seeing my wife realize she couldn't afford a lawyer anywhere close to his level made it worth every penny. A good divorce lawyer is invaluable. Mine was worth every cent of his $400 per hour fee. When we went to court, he didn't just present the evidence, he painted a story. He showed the judge photos of them together after I'd explicitly asked her to stop seeing him. Then he pulled up the WhatsApp messages where they openly discussed their affair. The judge's face when he read their conversations about how thrilling it was to sneak around was priceless. But my lawyer wasn't done. He was like a forensic accountant, combing through our joint account history with a fine-tooth comb. He found restaurant charges at places I'd never been, matching them perfectly with texts where Dimitri thanked her for dinner. There were movie tickets, museum visits, even a weekend trip they'd disguised as a business conference, all paid for from our joint account with money I'd earned. The kicker was when he found charges from Victoria's Secret. On days she texted Dimitri about a special surprise. That was the moment her lawyer's face just dropped. My lawyer portrayed me as the hardworking husband who'd helped his wife start her business, covered her rent, and supported her dreams. Meanwhile, she was using our money to wine and dine her boyfriend. He even highlighted how I'd paid for her cafe's rent in that fancy part of town, which she'd turned into her personal dating spot. Her lawyer tried to bring up petty arguments, like how I worked late sometimes or didn't read the book she recommended. The judge literally rolled his eyes at that one. In the end, justice was served. I kept everything thanks to the prenup, and there were no alimony payments, given the infidelity and the fact that I'd funded her entire business. I did have to let her keep the cafe and the Audi I'd bought for her, since we didn't have any official contracts for their ownership. Getting back at Dimitri was a bit trickier. I didn't want to risk jail time over two people who weren't worth it. But one day, an opportunity came up. I saw him leaving the cafe, probably after another cozy afternoon with my ex, paid for by her cafe's profits. I followed him around the corner, waiting until we were out of sight from security cameras and casual passersby. I called his name, and when he turned, I introduced myself. "Hey, Dimitri, I'm ex-wife's husband." The look on his face was perfect, right before my fist connected with his jaw. My hand hurt like hell, but seeing him sprawled on the sidewalk made it worth it. His lip was bleeding, and he looked completely stunned. You'd think a guy who sleeps with married women would expect an angry husband at some point. I was ready if he wanted to fight back, but he just got up, wiped the blood off his face, and walked away. I guess his tough guy act only works on unfaithful wives. I wanted to do more, but one punch was all I could risk without facing assault charges. The sweetest part of my revenge came later. The cafe's rent was due on May 1st, a hefty $4,500 for that prime downtown location she insisted on. By mid-May, my phone was blowing up. It was my ex, crying about not being able to make rent. Turns out, running a cafe isn't so easy when you actually have to pay the bills instead of using the money on your boyfriend. She kept pleading, saying she'd pay me back, offering partial ownership, anything to keep her precious cafe. Each time, I had the same response: sell the Audi. She'd start sobbing, saying she needed the car to run her business. Eventually, I just blocked her number. A week later, my brother sent me a screenshot from Facebook Marketplace. There was her precious white Audi, listed for a desperate quick sale. After selling the car, she actually called me from a different number, yelling about how cruel I was for making her sell it. She claimed I was destroying her life's work by not helping with rent. I just laughed and reminded her how she thought it was fun and exciting to cheat on me in the cafe I paid for. That shut her up pretty quickly. I haven't heard from her since. I'm honestly looking forward to next May. Without my financial support, without my bookkeeper managing her finances, and without her fancy car to keep up appearances, I'm betting the cafe won't last another year. The book club ladies who used to adore her sophisticated taste have mostly stopped coming around. Turns out, publicly getting served divorce papers for cheating isn't great for business. My brother drove by last week and said the place was pretty empty. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just getting even, it's moving forward and living well. Thanks for all the support, everyone. Pretty sure this is my last update. I've got better things to focus on than the past. Commentary time. This story is an emotional roller coaster. OP went all in to support his wife's dreams, pouring his heart and hard-earned money into helping her create the perfect cafe, only to find himself blindsided by her secret romance novel affair. It's almost unreal how she let herself drift into a fantasy, creating a twisted story with her mysterious Serbian customer, while disregarding the very real, very supportive partner she had at home. When OP noticed the red flags, he played it smart. Rather than blowing up, he documented everything, setting himself up for an exit plan that would leave no room for excuses. And when the evidence confirmed his suspicions, he didn't just confront her with a typical, "You're cheating." He had her served in the cafe in front of her loyal customers, turning the moment into a reality check for her and her dream. Her fantasy shattered, OP didn't stop there. He went for the ultimate payback by letting her cafe, her pride and joy, struggle without his financial support. It's ironic, almost poetic, to see her try to salvage what she nearly threw away for someone who could never compare. OP's story isn't just about revenge. It's a masterclass in handling betrayal with dignity. He could have blown up, taken risks, or let emotions cloud his judgment, but he kept his cool and handled it with precision. Now, his ex-wife's affair is history, and OP is free to move on, having shown her, and all of us, that sometimes the most satisfying way to deal with betrayal is to let the person face their own self-created chaos. His journey serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how bad things get, we can always rise above and take control of our own narrative. If you're as impressed by OP's story as we are, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. How would you handle this kind of betrayal? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more stories like this one, where resilience, self-worth, and sometimes a little payback make for the best endings. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.